He didn't knock. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Ezekiel Crow never knocked. He simply opened the door to her father's bakery like he already owned it, like the space between his desire and his possession was nothing more than a formality he'd already decided to skip. He walked in on a Tuesday morning, set a leather satchel on the flour-dusted counter without asking, and looked at Henry Ashby the way a man looks at a horse he's already paid for. "The papers are signed," Crow said. Not to Clara. Never to Clara. "She comes with me Friday." Clara was 17 steps away, behind the bread rack, close enough to hear every word, close enough to see the way her father's hand shook when he nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't even look at her. And in that moment, flour still on her hands, bread still rising in the oven behind her, Clara understood that her life as she knew it was already over. What? If you were her, standing in that bakery, watching your own father nod away your future, what would you do? This is the story of a woman who refused to disappear quietly, and the stranger who made sure she didn't have to. If stories like this speak to something inside you, subscribe right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me your city or your country. I want to see how far this story travels, because every time I read your comments from places I've never been, I realize these stories matter far beyond these walls. Don't miss what comes next. Now let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 1883 arrived in Caldwell Crossing like a punishment. The heat came early and stayed mean, baking the dirt roads into something closer to clay tile, cracking the paint on storefronts, turning the air above the main street into a shimmer that made the whole town look like it was dissolving at the edges. Dogs stopped barking around noon and didn't start again until sundown. People moved slower, spoke less, and kept their opinions to themselves more than usual, which in a town like Caldwell Crossing was saying something, because the people there had made something of an art form out of looking the other way. Clara Ashby had grown up understanding that particular art better than most. She was 23 years old and had spent the better part of a decade running the family bakery, while her father, Henry, spent the better part of that same decade running from everything else. From grief, mostly. Her mother had died of a fever when Clara was 14, and Henry Ashby had never quite figured out how to be a man without a woman telling him he was one. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even particularly weak, not in the way some men were weak. He didn't drink himself senseless, or beat his children, or gamble at cards until the sun came up. He was just hollow. He moved through the rooms of their house and the hours of their days like something had taken the essential piece out of him, and he hadn't ever found a replacement. Clara understood grief. She'd lived inside her own version of it for 9 years, but she'd also learned something her father never had. That grief, if you let it, will make decisions for you. It will sign things. It will nod at the wrong people. It will say yes when yes means something you won't be able to take back. She found out about the debt in pieces, the way you find out about most things that are designed to ruin you. First it was the flour supplier, Mr. Graves, who came in one morning looking embarrassed in a way that men in that era only looked embarrassed when they had to say something to a woman that they'd rather say to a man. He told her, hat in hand, that the account was 3 months behind. Clara had frowned because she kept the ledger herself and the account wasn't 3 months behind according to any number she could find. She pulled the book. She showed him the entries. He looked at the entries and then looked at the wall behind her head and said quietly that there was another account. A different one that her father had opened separately. She thanked Mr. Graves and walked to the back of the bakery and stood over the bread she was shaping and kept her hands moving while her mind worked the problem. Another account. Her father, behind her back, had opened another line of credit she didn't know about. It was worse than she thought. Over the next week, she pieced it together, receipt by receipt, conversation by careful conversation. Her father had borrowed money 14 months ago. A private lender, not a bank. Banks had stopped extending credit to Henry Ashby 2 years prior, a fact Clara had known and had believed meant he simply couldn't borrow anymore. She hadn't considered that private lenders operated by different rules, that some of them weren't really in the business of lending money at all, that some of them were in the business of acquiring things through the vehicle of debt, and that money was simply the instrument, not the point. The lender's name was Ezekiel Crow. Clara had heard the name before, the way you hear thunder before you understand a storm is coming. Crow operated across 3 counties, maybe 4. He was technically a businessman. He owned boarding houses. He held mortgages. He ran something he called a labor placement service that connected desperate people with work opportunities in distant towns. On paper, everything he did was legal. In practice, everyone with enough sense to pay attention knew that the people who entered Crow's orbit very rarely left it on their own terms. The boarding houses weren't really boarding houses. The work placements weren't really placements. They were arrangements, obligations, chains made of paper and ink, and the legally binding signatures of people who hadn't understood what they were signing. Her father had borrowed $400. He had paid back $260 over 14 months, which was an amount that had left him with almost nothing for their actual expenses, which was why he'd gone to Mr. Graves on that second secret account in the first place. And despite those payments, according to the document Clara finally found folded into the back of her father's Bible, she didn't know why she looked there, only that she did. The debt had somehow grown rather than shrunk. The interest terms were written in language so dense and circular that she had to read each clause 4 times before she understood what it meant. And when she finally understood it, she sat down on the kitchen floor and put her back against the wall and breathed slowly through her nose the way she did when she was trying not to do something she couldn't undo. The debt could not be repaid. That was the point. The terms had been constructed specifically so that the debt could not be repaid through payment alone. The only way out was the surrender of a qualifying asset. She was the qualifying asset. There was a clause, paragraph 7, subclause C, written in ink so faded she'd almost missed it, that stated that in the event of default, the lender retained the right to petition for legal guardianship of any unmarried adult female dependent of the borrower to be transferred to the lender's household or designated placement for a period not to exceed 5 years. 5 years. Clara read it 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time, because she needed to be certain she wasn't misreading it, wasn't misunderstanding the legal language, wasn't catastrophizing a clause that had some other reasonable interpretation she was missing in her distress. But she wasn't missing anything. The language was exactly what it appeared to be. Her father had signed a document that gave Ezekiel Crow the legal right to claim her as a dependent ward if the debt went into default. And the debt had gone into default 11 days ago. She went to her father that evening after the bakery closed. She found him sitting on the porch with the particular stillness of a man who has run out of ways to avoid a thing he's done. He didn't look surprised to see the document in her hand. He didn't make excuses, which was somehow worse than if he had, because it meant he'd known it was coming and had let it come anyway, had let the days run down without telling her, without warning her, without giving her any chance to fight it herself. "I thought he'd give me more time," Henry said. That was all. "I thought he'd give me more time." Clara looked at her father for a long moment. She thought about 14 months of secret payments. She thought about the way he'd been slightly more willing than usual to send her on errands across town, to have her mind her business in the back of the bakery, to discourage her from talking to certain people. She thought about all the small arrangements he'd been making to keep her from knowing until there was no longer any point in her knowing. "When does he come?" she asked. "Friday," her father said. "He said Friday morning." That was 3 days away. Clara went back inside and put the document in her apron pocket and finished washing the pans from the day's baking. Her hands moved through the familiar motions, the scrub, the rinse, the stack, and she let them move while her mind worked the problem the way it had always worked problems, which was methodically and without the luxury of falling apart. She was not the kind of woman who fell apart. She'd never had the option. She needed to think. The next morning, she opened the bakery at 5 o'clock as usual, shaped the first loaves, set them to rise, and was sliding the second batch into the oven when the bell above the door rang and a man she didn't recognize walked in. He was tall in a way that had nothing to do with height and everything to do with how he carried himself. Like the space around him was his to move through, and he wasn't in any particular hurry about it. He wore the clothes of a man who worked outdoors, worn at the knees and collar, but not dirty. His boots were the kind that had been resoled more than once. His face was weathered in that particular way that happened to people who spent more time in mountain air than town air, and there was a scar along the left side of his jaw that looked old enough to have become part of his face. He didn't look at her the way men usually looked at her, either too much or carefully, not at all. He just looked at her the way you look at a person you're intending to speak to. "Morning," he said. "I'll take whatever's already baked. Don't need to wait on fresh." "I have rolls from an hour ago," Clara said, "and 2 loaves of cornbread." "That'll do." He paid without negotiating, which was unusual enough in itself. He was turning toward the door when he stopped, and Clara would later think that what came next was either the most improbable thing that had ever happened to her, or the most precisely timed, depending on how you thought the world worked. "You've got a bruise," he said. He wasn't accusing her of anything, wasn't being dramatic about it. He said it the way you'd tell someone there was mud on their shoe. Clara's hand went involuntarily to her wrist, where the mark from Crow's hand he'd been in the day before, to remind her father of Friday, and he'd put his hand on Clara's arm in the specific way that men like him did things, which was with just enough pressure to make the point without crossing a line anyone else would witness, was covered by her sleeve, but apparently not by her sleeve and her sleeve alone. "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't ask if you were fine," the man said. He was looking at her now, with an attention that wasn't comfortable but wasn't threatening either. It was the attention of someone actually trying to understand something. "I said you've got a bruise." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She'd learned to be careful with strangers who showed unsolicited interest in her situation. She'd also learned over a lifetime of careful observation how to tell the difference between interest that was predatory and interest that was something else. This man wasn't looking at her like she was something he wanted. He was looking at her like she was something he was trying to figure out. "Do you know Ezekiel Crow?" she asked. She didn't know why she asked it. It came out before she'd made a decision to say it. Something changed in the man's face. Not dramatically. It wasn't the kind of change that announced itself. It was more like a door closing behind a set of eyes. "Why do you ask that?" he said. "Because he was in here yesterday," Clara said, "and that's where the bruise is from." The man set his bread back on the counter. He stood there for a moment looking at the rolls and the cornbread and the flour dust on the wooden surface between them, and then he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something between recognition and anger, and something older than either. "My name is Rowan Mercer," he said, "and I've been looking for a reason to be in this county for about 2 years. He told her, in the next 20 minutes, what he told almost nobody. That his younger sister had come through Caldwell Crossing 3 years ago, looking for work, and had ended up in one of Crow's boarding house placements, and had sent one letter home after arriving that said she was fine and had a position and that they shouldn't worry, and then had sent no letters after that. Rowan had been tracking the operation since. He hadn't found enough to do anything with. He knew the shape of it, but not the evidence. He knew the pattern, but not the proof. Clara listened. She didn't interrupt and she didn't offer sympathy because something in the set of his jaw told her that sympathy wasn't what he was here for. When he finished, she pulled the document out of her apron pocket and put it on the counter between them. He read it slowly. She watched his face while he read it. When he got to paragraph 7, subclause C, his jaw tightened in a way that told her he'd understood exactly what she'd understood when she'd read it the night before. "He files these before the debtor knows he's in default," Rowan said. He wasn't talking to her exactly. He was thinking out loud. "He's had the paper ready for weeks. Your father just didn't know to look." "How long do I have?" Clara asked. Rowan looked up at her. "Before he makes the guardianship legal? If the papers were filed when he said Friday, you've got less than 48 hours. The oven behind her clicked with heat. Somewhere in the street outside, someone was arguing about a horse. Clara Ashby looked at a man she had known for 20 minutes and calculated, with the cold efficiency of someone who had run a household on thin margins for 9 years, exactly how bad her options were. They were very bad. She was smart enough to know that, and she was just desperate enough to ask the question that was already forming at the back of her throat, the one she didn't know yet would change everything. "Is there a way out?" she said. "Not for my father, for me." Rowan Mercer looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Maybe, but it's not a comfortable answer." "Tell me anyway," Clara said. She had flour on her hands and bread still rising in the oven and a bruise on her wrist from the man who thought he already owned her future. She was listening. Rowan didn't sit down when he said it. He stayed standing, which Clara would later think was either a habit or courtesy, giving her the option to throw him out without the awkwardness of watching him get up from a chair first. "There's a territorial law," he said, "old one. Most people don't know it exists because most people don't go looking for laws until they need them. It says that a legally married adult woman cannot be transferred through guardianship proceedings. The marriage has to be real, registered with the magistrate, witnessed, on record. But if it's on record before Crow files the final transfer paperwork, the guardianship becomes legally void." Clara had her arms crossed. Not defensively, she'd crossed them because she was cold, because even in summer the bakery ran cold in the mornings before the ovens had been going long enough, and because she was thinking hard and crossing her arms was something she did when she was thinking hard. "You're talking about marriage," she said. "I'm talking about a legal instrument," Rowan said. "That's all it would be. On paper." "On paper," Clara repeated. She didn't say it with contempt exactly. She said it with the flat, careful tone of a woman who had learned not to react to things before she'd finished thinking about them. "And what do you get out of it?" "Access," he said. "Right now I'm a stranger in this county with a folder of observations and no standing to bring any of them to anyone who matters. If I'm married to a woman Crow has actively targeted, and I can demonstrate that he attempted to use fraudulent guardianship to acquire her, that changes what I can do. That gives me standing. That gives me a witness who can testify to direct harm. So you need me as much as I need you." "More, maybe," he said. He said it without flinching, which she respected. Clara uncrossed her arms. She walked to the oven, checked the bread, not because it needed checking, but because she needed a moment where her hands were doing something, and then came back to the counter and stood across from him again. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't know if you're telling the truth about your sister." "You don't." "I don't know if this law is real, or if the magistrate will honor it, or if Crow has already bought the magistrate the way he's apparently bought everyone else in this town." "All true," Rowan said. "I can't guarantee any of those things." "Then why would I do it?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, but the quiet of someone deciding whether the honest answer was the right one to give. "Because your other option is Friday," he said, "and I don't think you're the kind of woman who waits for Friday." Clara looked at him. She thought about her father on the porch the night before. The way he'd said, "I thought he'd give me more time," like that was an explanation for anything, like time had been the problem and not the choices he'd made in it. She thought about Crow's hand on her arm, the precise, deliberate pressure of it, the way he'd looked past her to her father when he'd done it, making sure Henry saw, making sure Henry understood. She thought about paragraph 7, subclause C. "I need to see the law," she said, "written down. I'm not doing anything based on your word alone." "Fair," Rowan said. "I have a copy in my saddlebag. I can get it." "Get it," Clara said. He was back in 4 minutes. She read the document twice. It was real, or at least it was a real document, aged in the right way, citing the right territorial code numbers, written in the kind of legal language that didn't feel invented. She'd have to take some portion of this on faith, no matter what, and she was aware of that. And she was aware that taking things on faith had gotten her father into this situation in the first place. But there was a difference between her father's faith, which was the faith of a man who wanted to believe everything would work out, and the kind of faith Clara was considering now, which was the faith of a woman who had looked at her options, found them terrible, and was choosing the least terrible one with her eyes open. "If I do this," she said, "and it doesn't work, if Crow finds a way around it, I need to know you won't just disappear." "I won't disappear," Rowan said. "That's not a guarantee." "No," he said. "It's a statement of intent. It's the best I can give you right now." She folded the document and held it in her hands for a moment. Outside, the morning was getting louder. Wagon wheels, someone calling to someone else, the ordinary noise of a town going about its ordinary Tuesday. "All right," Clara said. She handed the document back to him. "Tell me what we need to do." What they needed to do turned out to be more complicated than the idea of it suggested, which was true of most things that looked simple from the outside. The magistrate's office opened at 8. Rowan knew the law well enough to know they needed 2 witnesses who were not family members and not employed by Crow, which in a town where Crow had been operating for years turned out to be a narrower category than it sounded. They needed the marriage recorded before the end of business Wednesday, which gave them roughly 36 hours, and they needed to be certain that word didn't reach Crow before the filing was complete, because if Crow learned what they were doing before it was done, he had both the money and the connections to find a way to interfere with the process. Clara thought of two people: Marin Holloway, who was 64 years old and ran the dry goods store on the east end of Main Street and had been openly hostile to Crow since he'd tried to claim her building 2 years earlier and she'd threatened to shoot him on her front step. And Thomas Dell, who was the retired schoolteacher, who had nothing Crow could take and no family in the territory Crow could threaten, and who Clara trusted because he'd been her teacher and had never once in her experience said something that turned out to be untrue. She explained the situation to both of them that afternoon, separately, in plain terms without dramatizing it. Marin said yes before Clara had finished the second sentence. Thomas took the full explanation and then sat quietly for a moment and then said, "What time?" "Sunrise," Clara said. "I need it done before the morning traffic gives anyone a reason to be on that street." Thomas nodded. "I'll be there." The hardest part of Tuesday was not planning the marriage. It was going home to her father. Henry Ashby was in the kitchen when Clara came in, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold, looking at the grain of the wood in the way men look at things when they're not really seeing them. He looked up when she came in, and there was something in his face that wanted to be relief. Like maybe she'd come home with an answer, like maybe she'd solved the problem the way she'd always solved problems, quietly, and without making him feel worse than he already did. She hadn't planned to tell him. She'd thought, on the walk home, that she'd say nothing, that she'd go through with it in the morning and tell him after it was done. But she looked at him sitting there with his cold coffee and his hollow expression, and she thought, no, he needs to know. Not because he deserved the courtesy. She wasn't feeling particularly courteous, but because she needed him to understand what she was doing and why. So that years from now, if he ever tried to tell himself a story about this that made him the victim of circumstances, he would have the memory of this kitchen and this conversation to correct him. "I'm getting married tomorrow morning," she said. She didn't sit down. "To a man I met today. His name is Rowan Mercer. It's a legal arrangement, not a real one, but it'll be on the magistrate's record and it'll be binding, and once it is, Crow can't touch me through the guardianship clause." Her father stared at her. His mouth opened and then closed. "Clara, I'm not asking for your permission," she said. "I'm 23 years old and I am telling you what I'm doing. You don't know this man." "I don't know most people," Clara said. "I didn't know Crow either, and you signed a document with his name on it anyway. At least I've read what I'm agreeing to." That landed the way she'd intended it to. Henry flinched. "I'm sorry," he said. It came out small, which was the right size for it. "I know," Clara said. Clara. She wasn't ready to say more than that, and she didn't. She put the kettle on for fresh coffee and started on dinner because people still needed to eat regardless of what else was happening. And she let the silence sit in the room between them until it settled into something less sharp than it had been. She didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the dark and listened to the house and thought about all the things she'd told herself her life would be when she was young enough to still believe that life went according to what you told yourself. She'd thought she'd have a bakery of her own by now. She'd thought she might marry someone she loved eventually when the time was right and the right person appeared. She'd thought the hardest thing she'd have to do in her 20s was manage the bookkeeping and keep the flower costs down. She hadn't thought she'd be lying awake calculating whether a stranger's word was reliable enough to bet her freedom on. But then, she supposed most people who ended up in the situations they ended up in hadn't thought that either. At 4 a.m, she got up, dressed, and went to the bakery. She shaped the bread by feel in the dark before she lit the lamp, because she'd done it so many times she didn't need to see it. The dough under her hands was the same as it always was. Cool, yielding, familiar. She let herself be in just that for a while. Just the bread. Just the work. At 5:30, Rowan appeared at the back door. She hadn't told him to come, but she wasn't surprised that he had. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "No," she said. He didn't come all the way in. He stood in the doorway, and she handed him a roll that was still warm enough to matter, and he ate it without ceremony, and they stood in the early morning quiet together, not talking, not performing comfort, just occupying the same space in the specific way that people occupy the same space when they're both nervous about the same thing, and there's nothing left to say about it. At 6:15, they walked to the magistrate's office. Marin was already there, standing straight as a fence post in her good coat, looking like she'd been waiting 20 minutes and would have waited 20 more without complaint. Thomas arrived 2 minutes later, slightly out of breath, his good hat slightly crooked. The magistrate's name was Edwin Potts, and he was a small, precise man who ran his office with the energy of someone who had seen enough human chaos to find paperwork genuinely soothing. He looked at the four of them when they came in, looked at the clock on his wall, looked back at them. "Early," he said. "We're aware," Clara said. "We'd like to register a marriage. Today, before the morning filing window closes." Potts looked at Rowan, then at Clara, then at Marin, who looked back at him with an expression that communicated, without words, that she had once threatened to shoot a man on her front step and had meant it. "Fill out the form," Potts said. He turned and retrieved a sheet from the cabinet behind him, set it on the counter, and produced a pen. The form took 8 minutes to complete. Rowan wrote carefully and without hesitation, which Clara noticed. People who hesitated on forms usually had something they were deciding whether to write truthfully. He didn't hesitate. The ceremony, such as it was, took 4 minutes. Potts read the required language in a flat, professional voice. Clara repeated the required words. Rowan repeated his. Marin and Thomas signed as witnesses. Potts stamped the document with a stamp that Clara had never found particularly significant before, and now found the most significant thing she'd seen in her adult life. "Filed and recorded," Potts said. He handed Clara a copy. "Congratulations, I suppose." Outside, the morning was coming up properly now. Light spreading across the rooftops, a wagon moving somewhere on the far side of town. The first sounds of Caldwell Crossing deciding to be awake. Clara stood on the step outside the magistrate's office with the copy of her marriage certificate in her hands and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not relief but a specific kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion that comes when you've been holding something tense for so long that the moment you can release it, your whole body suddenly remembers how tired it is. Marin put a hand briefly on her shoulder, said nothing, and walked away in the direction of her store. Thomas said, "You did a brave thing," and then seemed to realize that wasn't quite the right thing to say, and corrected it to a smart thing, which was closer. Rowan stood beside her and looked out at the street. "What now?" Clara asked. "Now we wait for him to try," Rowan said. She didn't have to wait long. Crow arrived at the bakery at 9 Thursday morning, a full day early, which meant someone had told him something, which meant the word had gotten out faster than she'd hoped. He came with a man she didn't recognize, heavy-set, standing slightly behind and to the right in the way that men who are paid for their size stand. He came in without knocking, the same as always, and he looked at Clara behind the counter, and then he looked at the room, and then he looked back at Clara, and something changed in his expression. Not dramatically, not the collapse of a man who'd been defeated, but the recalculation of a man who had encountered an unexpected obstacle. He was tall and well-dressed in the way that men who want to be taken seriously dress. Not fashionable, exactly, but expensive. He had a face like something left in the sun too long, creased and deliberate. His eyes were the particular pale gray of someone who had learned a long time ago that the best way to make people uncomfortable was to look at them without blinking slightly longer than was natural. "Miss Ashby," he said. "Mrs. Mercer," Clara said. She said it flat and even. She wasn't performing confidence. She just didn't see the point in inflating this moment with drama. Crow was still for a moment. Then he put both hands on the counter in front of him, slowly, like he was setting something down. "I don't know what someone told you," he said, "but whatever you've done, it won't hold. I've got 4 lawyers in this territory, and every one of them will find a way through whatever paper you think you've put between yourself and your obligations." "My father's obligations," Clara said, "not mine. And I've read the law, Mr. Crow. You might want to have your lawyers read it too before they spend your money on something they can't fix." The heavy-set man behind Crow shifted his weight. Crow didn't look at him. He kept looking at Clara. "Your father still owes me money," he said. "My father owes you $140 by my calculation," Clara said. which is what remains after you subtract the payments he's already made from the original principal, which is all you're legally entitled to collect. The interest structure in that document has 3 clauses that won't survive a challenge in federal court, and I suspect you know that. She hadn't known that with certainty when she said it. She'd read enough of the document to believe it, but believing something and knowing it were different things. She said it with the tone of someone who knew it because she'd learned, in 9 years of running a business on thin margins, that the tone you used when discussing money was sometimes more important than the numbers themselves. Crow looked at her for a long time. "You're smarter than your father," he said. "Most people are," Claire said. He picked his hands up from the counter. He looked around the bakery one more time, at the shelves, at the ovens, at the bread she'd shaped at 4 in the morning in the dark, with the look of a man making a calculation about whether this particular fight was worth the cost. "We'll see," he said, and he left. The heavy-set man followed him out. The bell above the door rang twice, once when Crow opened it, once when it swung shut. Then it was quiet. Clara stood behind the counter and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She hadn't noticed until now. She looked down at them, flour-dusted, slightly trembling, the same hands that had shaped bread at 4 in the morning and written her name on a marriage certificate an hour later. And she thought, well, he knows, and he's not done. Rowan appeared from the back of the bakery, where he'd been since 7, on the grounds that if Crow showed up early, it was better to have someone present who wasn't her father. He'd spent 2 hours being mostly quiet and reading a water-damaged almanac he'd found on a shelf, and he'd made himself coffee without asking, which she'd decided to find practical rather than presumptuous. "He'll send someone to challenge the filing," Rowan said. "I know," Clara said, "and when that doesn't work, he'll try something else." "I know that too." Rowan stood beside the counter and looked at the door Crow had just walked out of. "He's not going to let this go because you filed a piece of paper. Men like him don't see paper as the point. The paper is just the thing they use when they want to make the thing they're already doing look legitimate." "So what does he do when the paper stops working?" Clara asked. "He applies pressure somewhere else," Rowan said. "Your father, your suppliers, anyone who matters to you that he can reach." Clara thought about Mr. Graves and his embarrassed face and the second account she hadn't known about. She thought about the other suppliers, the ones she'd built relationships with over years, the ones whose goodwill had gotten her through lean months. She thought about what happened to any of those relationships if Crow decided to make them expensive. "We can't stay here," she said. It wasn't a question. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "I've got a place in the mountains. Homestead, about 4 hours out. It's not comfortable. It's not close to anything. But it's mine, the title's clear, and Crow's got no reach up there." Clara looked around the bakery. She looked at the ovens, the shelves, the worn wooden counter she'd stood behind for most of her adult life. She looked at the flour dust on everything, the way the morning light came through the single window and made the inside of the bakery feel, for about an hour every morning, like something worth keeping. "My father can't run this place alone," she said. "No," Rowan agreed. "He can't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He'll have to learn." It was the hardest sentence she'd said since she'd told her father she was getting married. Not because she didn't mean it, but because meaning it meant accepting something about her father that she'd been carefully not accepting for 9 years, which was that the bakery had been hers because she'd made it hers, and that the life she'd built inside this flour-dusted space had been built despite Henry Ashby, not because of him. She started taking her apron off. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Tonight," Rowan said. "Before morning." "I need a few hours." "You have them." She spent those hours doing 3 things. She taught her father, in 2 concentrated sessions broken by the afternoon baking, the 6 most essential things about running the shop that he'd managed to avoid learning in a decade of standing inside it. She wrote out the ledger in clear language with clear instructions and left it on the kitchen table where he would find it. And she packed 1 bag, deliberately, taking only what she could carry without difficulty. A change of clothes, her mother's small pearl earrings which weren't valuable except to her, the folder of bakery documents, and the copy of her marriage certificate, which she folded and placed in the inside pocket of her coat where it would be the last thing she lost. She went to her father before she left. He was sitting in the same chair he always sat in, and the similarity to the night before, the cold coffee, the looking at the table expression, almost undid something in her, almost made her say something softer than she meant to. She didn't let it. "I'll write when I can," she said. "Pay Mr. Graves before you pay anyone else. Don't sign anything." Henry looked up at her. His eyes were wet, which she noticed and chose not to react to because she'd long since learned that her father's emotions, while real, had a way of becoming the center of any room he was in, and she didn't have time for this room to be about him. "Clara," he said. "Don't sign anything," she repeated. She picked up her bag and walked out. Rowan was waiting at the edge of town with 2 horses. He handed her the reins of a bay mare without ceremony. She mounted without asking for help. They rode north as the stars came out, leaving the sound of Caldwell Crossing behind them in stages. First the voices, then the wagon noise, then the smell of the town itself, which was smoke and manure and bread and sawdust all at once, in a combination she'd been breathing her entire life. She didn't look back, not because she wasn't sad. She was sad. In the specific, quiet way she was sad about most things, which was by feeling it fully and not performing it, but because looking back wouldn't change anything, and she had learned very early that the only direction that was ever any use was forward. They rode through the dark for 3 hours before Rowan pulled his horse to a slower pace and said, "You should sleep in the saddle if you can. There's another hour of climbing before we're off the main road." "I don't sleep in the saddle," Clara said. "Most people can't," he agreed. "I just meant that you should try. Tell me about your sister," she said instead. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "Her name is Ruth. She's 20. She is the kind of person who talks to strangers on trains, the kind who believes people are basically all right until they prove otherwise." "And Crow proved otherwise," Clara said. "I think someone in his operation did," Rowan said. "I don't know exactly what happened. That's the part I can't get to. I know she's somewhere in his network. I know she's been there for 3 years. I know the letters stopped." "Why didn't you go to the law?" "The law in this county is Crow," Rowan said flatly. Clara considered that. "Federal?" "That's the direction I'm trying to go," he said. "But to bring in federal investigators, you need evidence of a pattern, not one missing woman, not rumors, a documented pattern of fraudulent contracts and illegal transfer of persons across county lines. I've got most of it. I'm missing the piece that ties everything together." "The guardianship clause," Clara said. "That's one piece," he said. "Your testimony about the bruise, about him physically asserting possession before the guardianship was legally finalized. That's another." Clara thought about this. She thought about the other women, about the boarding houses Crow ran and what they actually were, about how many families had sat at their own kitchen tables with documents they didn't understand, the way her father had, and signed them because the man sitting across from them was confident and well-dressed and knew exactly how to make the thing he was offering sound like the only reasonable option. "How many women?" she asked. Rowan was quiet again. The horses' hooves on the mountain road made a steady, rhythmic sound in the dark. "More than a dozen that I've confirmed," he said. "Possibly twice that." Claire didn't respond immediately. She let the number sit. She let herself feel what it felt like to carry it. That specific weight of knowing that the thing that had nearly happened to you had already happened to other people, and had been happening for years, and would keep happening unless something stopped it. "Your marriage certificate," Rowan said after a while. "The one Potts filed this morning. That's evidence of the guardianship attempt. If we can connect it to the other cases, it becomes the pattern piece I've been missing." "You're saying I'm not just saving myself," Clara said. "I'm saying you might be the thing that saves a lot of people," Rowan said. "If you're willing." She looked at the dark road ahead of them. She couldn't see where it went. The mountain curve had swallowed the visible distance, and there was only the few feet of road that the moonlight reached, and beyond that, dark. "I'm willing," she said, "but I want you to understand something." "Tell me." "I'm not doing this for you," Clara said, "and I'm not doing it for some idea of justice that lives in the abstract. I'm doing it because Crow put his hand on my arm in my own bakery and looked at my father while he did it, and I want that to have cost him something real." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "That's the best reason I've heard," he said. They climbed in silence after that, the road getting narrower and the air getting cooler. the horses picking their way through the dark with the patient confidence of animals who knew this territory better than the people on their backs. Clara sat straight in the saddle. Her bag was strapped behind her, her marriage certificate in her inside coat pocket, the mountain ahead of her rising into a sky full of stars she hadn't seen properly in years, because in Caldwell Crossing there was always enough lamplight to drown them out. She was tired in ways she hadn't let herself acknowledge all day. Tired from the early morning, the ceremony, the confrontation with Crow, the afternoon of teaching her father things he should have learned years ago, the long riding dark. She let herself be tired. She didn't try to push it away or manage it into something more acceptable. The homestead appeared around a curve just after the second hour of climbing, a low, solid structure with a pitched roof and a porch that faced the valley below. It was nothing impressive. The wood was weathered, the window shutters were mismatched, and one corner of the porch railing was clearly newer than the rest, suggesting a repair done in a hurry. There was a smell of pine and cold water from a creek somewhere nearby. It was nothing she would have chosen. It was nothing she had chosen. She'd ended up here through a series of bad decisions made by her father and a series of fast decisions made by her. And the result was that she was standing in front of a stranger's house in the dark with one bag and a marriage certificate and the particular clarity that comes when everything has been stripped away and you're left with only what you actually are. Rowan opened the door and looked back at her. "There's a back room," he said. "It's small, but it's yours. I'll take the front." Clara picked up her bag and walked in. The room was small. The bed was narrow. The single window faced the mountain rather than the valley, which meant no morning light, which she noted and decided she could live with. She set her bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and listened to the sounds of a man she'd married that morning moving around in the next room. The particular sounds of someone trying to be quiet about ordinary things, trying to take up as little space as possible, trying to demonstrate through consideration what was too early to demonstrate any other way. She thought about Ruth Mercer, 20 years old, who talked to strangers on trains. She thought about the dozen women Rowan had confirmed, and the dozen more he suspected. She thought about Crow saying, "We'll see," with the particular confidence of a man who had never yet been wrong about what he was going to get. She lay back on the narrow bed in her clothes and stared at the ceiling. Whatever she'd been before today, a baker's daughter, a woman with flour on her hands and numbers in her head, and a future someone else had signed away. She wasn't only that anymore. She didn't know exactly what she was instead, but she was going to find out. She woke before dawn the first morning because her body didn't know how to do anything else. 9 years of 4 o'clock mornings had built something in her that no amount of exhaustion could fully override, a kind of internal alarm that didn't care where she was or what had happened the day before. It just knew that bread didn't shape itself and ovens didn't light themselves, and the day didn't start without someone deciding it would. Except there was no oven here, not the kind she knew. She lay in the narrow bed for a moment, listening. The mountain was loud in a way she hadn't expected. Not loud like a town, but loud like something alive, full of wind in the pine trees and the distant sound of water moving over rocks, and the occasional creak of the cabin settling against the cold. It was the kind of noise that took getting used to, the kind that people who'd grown up in it probably stopped hearing, but that hit someone from a town like a whole new language she didn't yet have the vocabulary for. She got up. She found the kitchen by feel, lit the lamp on the table, and assessed what she had to work with. The situation was honest, which was another way of saying it was rough. There was a cast iron stove that was nothing like her baker's oven, smaller, less predictable, the kind that required a specific relationship between wood size and draft adjustment that she didn't have and would need to develop. There was a sack of cornmeal, some dried beans, salt pork hanging from a ceiling hook, coffee, and a jar of something she eventually identified as honey. There was a skillet that had been seasoned well at some point in its life and neglected recently. There was a tin cup with a handle that had been reattached with wire. She made coffee and cornmeal and figured out the stove's temper by burning the first batch of meal and adjusting from there. Rowan came out of the front room when he smelled the coffee. He looked at the burned scrape in the skillet and then at the second, better batch of meal she was finishing and didn't say anything about the first one, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. "You didn't have to cook," he said. "I was awake," she said. "And you don't have enough food." He sat down. She put coffee in the tin cup and cornmeal in a bowl she found in the back of the cabinet, and he ate without complaint, which she also noted. "There's a supply run I do every 2 weeks," he said. "We'll need to do it sooner now." "How far is the nearest town that isn't Caldwell Crossing?" she asked. "Varden," he said. 8 miles east, smaller. Crow has less reach there." "Less," she said. "Not none." "Less," he confirmed. She thought about this while she ate her own portion of the cornmeal, which was better than the first batch, but still not what she'd call good. The stove ran hotter on the left side. She'd figured that out too late. She'd know for next time. That was how the first weeks worked. She learned things by failing at them first, which was irritating and also the only way. She learned the stove by burning things. She learned the rhythm of the water supply, a creek that ran clean but required a longer walk than she was used to, by carrying too little on the first trip and too much on the second, and eventually finding the right amount for the right container. She learned which of the mountain trails around the homestead were safe to walk alone, and which ones Rowan had quietly suggested she not take without telling her exactly why he'd suggested it, which she eventually pressed him on. "There's a man named Holt," he said. "He does work for Crow. Delivery mostly, surveillance sometimes. He rides the lower trail about twice a week." "You knew Crow had eyes up here, and you didn't tell me," Clara said. "I told you now." "That's not the same thing." "No," he said. "It's not. I should have told you sooner." She looked at him. He didn't look away, which she'd noticed was a consistent quality in him. He didn't look away from things he'd done wrong. He just acknowledged them and kept looking. It was a different kind of accountability than she was used to. Her father's version of accountability was collapsing under the weight of it. Rowan's version was staying upright while carrying it. "Which trail does Holt not use?" she asked. He told her. She used that trail after that. But learning the physical landscape of the mountain was the easier part. The harder part was learning to exist in close proximity to a person she didn't know, with no buffer of ordinary social life to fill the silences. In Caldwell Crossing, there had always been something to do that wasn't about the people in the room. A customer to help, bread to check, a ledger to update. Here, the work was different, and the silences were longer, and there was nothing to hide behind when the day got quiet, and the two of them were just two people in a small cabin who had made a practical arrangement and were now required to live inside it. Rowan was not an easy person to read. He was not unfriendly, but he was not forthcoming either. He answered questions when asked, directly and without embellishment, and he asked very few questions of his own, which she couldn't decide if she respected or found maddening. He did things without announcing them, cut extra firewood before the weather turned, fixed the porch railing she'd noticed was loose, left a pair of work gloves she hadn't asked for on the table where she'd find them when she went out to the creek. She didn't thank him for the gloves. She put them on and used them and didn't say anything, because saying thank you for the gloves felt like it was also saying something about the situation between them that she wasn't ready to say, and she thought he understood that because he didn't mention it either. The letter from her father arrived 12 days after she'd left. It came through Varden's small post office, addressed in Henry's uneven hand, and Rowan brought it back from the supply run without comment. She opened it at the kitchen table and read it twice. The news was a mix of things. The bakery was running, barely. Mr. Graves had continued supplying flour on existing credit, which meant Henry hadn't panicked and signed something new. 2 of Crow's men had come by on Friday, the original Friday, the one she'd been supposed to appear, and Henry had told them she was married and gone. He'd written that part in a shaky hand, like the act of reporting it still unsteadied him. They'd threatened him. He hadn't said with what, specifically. He'd said he was all right. At the bottom of the letter, in smaller writing than the rest, "I know I don't have the right to ask this, but please be careful." Clara put the letter down and sat with it for a while. She wasn't angry reading it. She'd moved past the acute anger in the first few days, replaced it with something more durable and less hot, a kind of long, clear-eyed reckoning with who her father was and what she could and couldn't expect from him. He loved her in the way that people love things they've failed to protect, desperately and belatedly, and with a guilt that didn't know what to do with itself. She wrote back. She kept it practical. She told him which creditor to prioritize and what to do if Crow's men returned, which was to send word through Marin Holloway. She told him she was fine without elaborating on what fine meant up here, because fine was relative and he didn't need to worry about the specifics. She didn't tell him that Crow had already made his first move on the mountain. That had happened on the 10th day. She'd been on the upper trail, the safe one, carrying water back from the creek, when she heard the horse below her on the lower trail. Holt's trail, the one she wasn't supposed to be on but was close enough to hear. She'd stopped and stood quietly in the trees and listened. One horse, moving slowly, and then the horse stopping, and then a voice she didn't recognize calling up toward where the cabin would be visible from that vantage point. "Mercer, you got a message." Rowan's voice from somewhere closer to the cabin, controlled and even. "Leave it at the post in Varden. I don't take messages at home." "Mr. Crow thought you might want this one in person," the voice said. There was a pause. "The matter of your wife and a fraudulent filing. He says the magistrate's going to be audited. Says Potts was in violation of 3 procedural codes when he registered the paperwork." Another pause. "Says if you want to avoid making this uglier than it needs to be, there's an arrangement he's willing to discuss." "Tell him I'll discuss it in federal court," Rowan said. The horse stayed where it was for a moment. Then it started moving again, downhill, back the way it had come. Clara waited until the sound of it disappeared before she walked back to the cabin. She set the water down and looked at Rowan, who was standing on the porch looking at the lower trail. "He's going after the filing," she said. "He's going to try," Rowan said, "but he can't unfile it. He can challenge Potts's procedure, but Potts ran a clean process. We had 2 witnesses. Everything was in order. Any challenge he brings will take time he doesn't have." "Why doesn't he have time?" Clara asked. Rowan looked at her then, with an expression she'd begun to learn, which was the expression of someone deciding how much to say and coming down on the side of saying more. "Because I wrote to a federal investigator 6 weeks ago," he said. "A man named Aldridge, out of the district office. I sent him everything I had. He wrote back 3 weeks ago saying he was reviewing the material. Last week I sent him a follow-up with your guardianship document attached." Clara stared at him. "You sent the document? My document?" "A copy. I had one made in Varden before the supply run." "You didn't ask me," she said. "No," he said. "I should have." "That's twice now," Clara said, "that you've done something significant without asking me first." He didn't look away. "You're right. I was moving fast and I told myself the result was what mattered. And I didn't think about the fact that it's your document and your name and your situation and that you should be deciding what happens with it." She looked at him for a long moment. She was angry, and she was aware that part of the anger was justified, and part of it was the accumulated frustration of 12 days of learning a new life in a small space, and she tried to be fair about which part was which. "If Aldridge comes up here," she said, "I'll talk to him. But I want to know before he gets here, not after he's already on the trail." "Agreed," Rowan said. "And I want to see whatever you've sent him," she said. "Everything? All of it." He went inside and came out with a leather folder she hadn't known existed. He put it on the table and she spent 2 hours reading it while the light moved across the cabin floor. It was thorough in a way she hadn't expected. Not just her case, the other cases, the pattern. The documented instances of fraudulent guardianship filings across 3 counties. The testimony of 2 men who'd worked for Crow's operation and had quietly left it and had been willing to write down what they knew. The labor contracts for the boarding houses, written in the same dense, circular language as the document her father had signed. The names of 17 women who had entered Crow's placement operation over the past 4 years and whose current whereabouts were unknown. 17. He'd said more than a dozen the night they'd ridden up the mountain. The number had grown. She got to the page with Ruth's name on it. Ruth Eleanor Mercer, age 20, last known location Caldwell Crossing boarding house. Last contact with family, 3 years prior. There was a physical description written in someone else's handwriting, Rowan's, she realized, from memory. And it was specific in the way that grief-driven descriptions were specific, noting the gap between her front teeth and the way she held her left shoulder higher than her right when she was nervous. Clara set the page down carefully. She didn't say anything for a moment. "She's still out there somewhere," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have to believe that," Rowan said. He was sitting across the table from her, and he said it quietly, the way people say things they've been carrying for a long time. "Then we have to move faster than we're moving," Clara said. "Aldridge is the fastest path," he said. "What does Aldridge need that he doesn't have yet?" she asked. "A witness who can testify to direct harm," Rowan said. "Someone who was personally targeted, who can describe the method, the debt structure, the guardianship clause, the specific way Crow positions himself to look legal while doing something that isn't. A witness who's articulate enough to hold up under cross-examination." Clara looked at him. He looked back at her. "That would be me," she said. "You'd have to go to the federal courthouse in Mill Haven," he said. "That's 2 days' ride south. It's not safe," she said. "I know. Tell me about the risk," he told her. Millhaven was bigger than Caldwell Crossing, which meant Crow's direct influence was thinner there, but it also meant more people, more variables, more chances for someone to recognize her and send word back. The road south went through a stretch of territory where Crow had operated longer than anywhere else, where his people knew the roads better than anyone. "I'd ride with you," Rowan said. "I assumed," she said. "We'd go before anyone expected it," he said, "fast and early." She thought about it. She thought about Potts's stamp on the document and Crow's hands on her counter, and the 17 names in the folder, and Ruth Mercer with her higher left shoulder. She thought about the women still in those boarding houses and the families sitting at kitchen tables with documents they couldn't understand. She thought about the fact that she'd told Rowan, on the night they rode up the mountain, that she was doing this because she wanted Crow to pay a real price, and that the gap between saying that and meaning it was exactly the distance between sitting in a mountain cabin and riding south to testify in a federal courthouse. "We go in 3 days," she said. "I need time to prepare what I'm going to say." "You don't need to prepare." "I know I don't need to," she said. "I want to. I want to say it right." He nodded. She spent the next 3 days writing, not a speech. She'd never been good at the formal kind of speech that sounded like a speech. She wrote the facts, in order, from the beginning: the debt structure, the interest terms, the guardianship clause, the bruise, Crow in the bakery with his hands on the counter saying, "We'll see." She wrote it the way she'd kept the ledger for 9 years. Clear, sequential, without embellishment, but without leaving out anything that mattered. On the second day, something happened that changed the timeline. Rowan had gone down the lower trail to check on something he didn't specify, and Clara was alone in the cabin when she heard a sound she wasn't expecting. Not a horse, but footsteps, light and fast, coming up the east side of the cabin toward the door. She stood up from the table and had the presence of mind to pick up the iron skillet before she moved toward the door, which she thought later was either good instinct or her body making decisions her mind hadn't caught up with yet. She opened the door before whoever it was could knock. It was a girl. Young, maybe 16, maybe a little older, but not much, wearing clothes that were wrong for the mountain in a way that said she'd been wearing them for too long in too many different weathers. She was breathing hard from the climb, and she had the look of someone who had been running from something and hadn't stopped to ask herself yet whether she'd run to the right place. She stared at Clara. Clara stared at her. "I was told," the girl said, catching her breath in pieces, "that there's a man up here who's trying to do something about Crow." Clara lowered the skillet. "Who told you that?" "Woman in Varden, at the dry goods." She hesitated. "She said to find Rowan Mercer." "He's not here right now," Clara said. "I'm his wife. Come inside." The girl hesitated on the threshold the way people hesitate when they've come a long way to ask for something, and now that they're there, they're not sure they actually trust the situation enough to cross the threshold. Clara understood that hesitation. She stepped back and left the door open and went to put coffee on, which was the most non-threatening thing she could think of, and after a moment she heard the girl come in behind her. Her name was Nora. She was 17. She had a sister who was 19, had been 19 when she'd gone into a Crow boarding house placement 2 years ago. She'd come because she'd heard something was happening. Someone was collecting evidence, and she had a letter. A letter her sister had managed to get out through a traveling merchant who'd felt sorry enough or guilty enough to carry it out of the placement house and eventually deliver it to their mother, who had passed it to Nora before she died. Nora pulled it from her coat and put it on the table between them. Clara didn't pick it up. "Do you want me to read it?" "I want someone to read it who can do something with it," Nora said. Her voice was steadier than her hands. Clara picked up the letter and read it carefully. It was 2 pages, small handwriting, the kind of writing that meant someone was trying to say a lot in a limited space because they couldn't be sure they'd get another chance to say it. It described the boarding house in specific terms: the address, the names of the people who ran it, the nature of the contracts, the women inside had been made to sign, the conditions, the punishments for refusing work, the way mail was read before it went out, how this letter had been written in pieces over 3 weeks and hidden in the lining of a coat until the merchant appeared. Clara set the letter down. "This is evidence," she said. "I know," Nora said. "That's why I came." "We're going to the federal courthouse in Mill Haven in 2 days," Claire said. "I want you to come with us." Nora looked at her. I thought you were in trouble too." "I am," Clara said. "That's not the same as being unable to do anything about it." Rowan came back an hour later. He found Clara and Nora at the table, the letter open between them, with Clara's 3-day stack of written testimony beside it, and a map of the road to Mill Haven that Rowan had drawn for himself weeks ago, now spread open on the other side. He looked at Nora. He looked at Clara. He looked at the map. "We leave tomorrow," Clara said. Not a question. Rowan looked at the letter. He read the address on it, the specific address of the boarding house, and something shifted in his face in the way that things only shift when you've been looking for something for a long time and you've just found it without expecting to. "That's Ruth's placement house," he said. His voice was careful in the way that people are careful with voices when they're trying not to break. Clara watched him absorb that. She watched him put it away, fold it into the part of himself that was keeping all the things he couldn't act on yet. "Tomorrow," he said. He said it to himself as much as to anyone. That night, Clara sat at the table after Nora had gone to sleep on the narrow bed and finished her written testimony by lamplight. She added the letter. She added Nora. She added the address. She wrote it all out in the same clear, sequential way she'd written the rest of it, and when she was done, she set the pen down and looked at what she had. It was 41 pages. It was a debt structure and a guardianship clause, and a bruise on her wrist and a letter hidden in a coat lining, and a girl who'd climbed a mountain because she'd heard someone was doing something. It was Ruth Mercer's gap-toothed description and 17 missing names and a stamp on a document in a magistrate's office at 6 in the morning with 2 witnesses who had shown up because they were asked to. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to start. She thought about Crow saying, "We'll see." She thought about Potts's stamp and Marin's straight spine and Thomas's slightly crooked hat and her father's cold coffee and the bread she'd baked in the dark at 4 in the morning because her hands didn't know how to stop. She thought about what it meant to walk into a federal courthouse with 41 pages and a voice and no certainty about what would happen next. Then she folded the pages, placed them in the leather folder alongside Rowan's evidence, and went to find a second bag to pack for the ride south. The mountain was loud around her, the pine trees and the water and the wind and the cold, all of it speaking in a language she was only beginning to learn. But she was learning it. That much she knew. She was learning it one burned skillet and one wrong trail and one letter at a time, and the woman who had baked bread in the dark and signed her name on a stranger's marriage certificate and decided that Friday wasn't going to be the end of anything. That woman was still here. She was, in fact, just getting started. They left before sunrise. Clara had the leather folder strapped to her body, under her coat, against her ribs. She'd decided on that arrangement the night before because it was the hardest place for someone to take it from her without her knowing immediately, and because she'd learned in the past 2 weeks that the difference between prepared and unprepared was sometimes as small as where you kept the things that mattered. Nora rode the spare horse that Rowan had acquired in Varden 2 weeks earlier without explaining why he'd acquired a spare, though Clara understood now that Rowan did most things for reasons he'd already thought through before anyone else had started thinking about them. It was a quality that had irritated her when she'd first noticed it. She'd made a kind of peace with it. The road south was 2 days of riding that felt longer because of the particular tension of moving through country where the variables were unfriendly. Rowan set a pace that was faster than comfortable and didn't apologize for it, and neither Clara nor Nora asked him to slow down. Nora rode like someone who had learned on a farm and hadn't done it in a while. slightly stiff, adjusting. Clara rode like someone who had learned in the last 2 weeks and was still figuring out the negotiation between what her body wanted to do and what the horse needed her to do. None of this was graceful. It didn't need to be graceful. They stopped twice, briefly, at stretches of road where Rowan judged the tree cover good enough to rest the horses without being visible from the main track. He didn't explain his reasoning out loud, just pulled off the road and waited. And Clara had learned enough by now to follow without requiring the explanation first. On the first stop, Nora ate the cornbread Clara had wrapped that morning and said, unprompted, "My sister's name is Della." "I know," Clara said. "I read the letter." She was funny," Nora said. "The kind of funny where she didn't know she was being funny. She'd say something completely ordinary and somehow it was the funniest thing you'd heard all week." She stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because she's a person," Clara said. "Not just a name in a letter." Nora looked at her. "Is that why you're doing this? For people you don't know?" Clara thought about it honestly. "Partly," she said, "and partly because if I don't, Crow wins something, and I've decided I can't tolerate that." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's more honest than I expected." "I'm not a particularly dishonest person," Clara said. "No," Nora said. "I can see that." They rode into Millhaven on the afternoon of the second day, coming in from the north road with the sun behind them, throwing long shadows ahead. Millhaven was twice the size of Caldwell Crossing and felt like 3 times as much. More noise, more people, more of the particular kind of activity that collected in towns that were growing faster than they'd planned for. Clara had never been here. The noise was familiar in its type, but not its volume, and she found herself recalibrating the way you recalibrate any time a place turns out to be different than what you'd built in your head. The federal courthouse was a solid stone building on the east side of the main street, 2 stories, with the particular self-important architecture of government buildings in that era. The wide steps, the heavy doors, the implicit message that whatever you were bringing to it had better be worth the building's time. Clara looked at it from across the street and felt, not fear exactly, but the specific kind of seriousness that comes when something you've been preparing for stops being preparation and becomes real. "Aldridge has an office on the 2nd floor, Rowan said. "He's expecting us." "When did you tell him we were coming?" Clara asked. "I sent a rider from Varden 3 days ago," Rowan said. "Before Nora arrived," Clara said. "Before Nora arrived," he confirmed. "But I'll send word up to him that we've brought additional testimony." He went ahead into the building. Clara and Nora stood outside for a moment on the wide steps. A man in a good coat walked past them without looking at them, which was the particular invisibility of 2 women standing somewhere that women didn't often stand, and Clara noted it and filed it in the same place she filed most things that irritated her, which was the place where she kept things to be dealt with later. "Have you ever done anything like this before?" Nora asked. "No," Clara said. "You?" "No," Nora said. "Does it feel as serious to you as it feels to me?" "More," Clara said. "Let's go in." The office of federal investigator James Aldridge was a room that had accumulated its occupation over a long period of time. Papers in organized stacks that had grown tall enough to lean, a map on the wall with pins in it that meant things Clara didn't yet have the context to decode, a desk that suggested a man who thought better when he had surfaces. Aldridge himself was 50 or close to it, with the build of someone who had spent a long time doing work that required both sitting and occasional urgency, and a face that was professionally unreadable in the way that people who interviewed witnesses professionally learned to make their faces unreadable. He stood when they came in, which Clara noticed and appreciated, and he extended his hand, which she shook without hesitation. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "Mr. Mercer told me something of your situation. I've reviewed the documents he sent." "Then you know the shape of it," Clara said. "I'm here to give you the inside." She sat across from his desk and put the leather folder on the surface between them and opened it. She didn't hand it to him immediately. She put her hands flat on it and looked at him. "Before I give you this," she said, "I need to understand what you can actually do, not what you intend to do, what you have the legal authority and the practical capacity to do, and what the timeline looks like." Aldridge looked at her for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between reassessment and something approaching respect. You prepared for this? I had 3 days, she said. I used them. He told her. He laid out in specific rather than general terms what a federal investigation of this type could accomplish: the authority to examine financial records across county lines, the capacity to subpoena witnesses and documentation, the ability to invalidate labor contracts found to be coercive, and the jurisdiction to pursue criminal charges for fraud and involuntary servitude. He told her the timeline was not fast. He told her that with sufficient evidence, he could begin formal proceedings within 2 weeks, but that formal proceedings and resolution were different things, and resolution could take months. Crow will know, Clara said. Once you begin formally, he'll know. Yes, Aldridge said, and he'll move to protect himself. He'll move against the people in his operation who might testify, and against the people in this room who already are. That's correct, Aldridge said, which is why the witness testimony has to be documented and secured before proceedings begin. Once it's in the federal record, it can't be threatened out of existence. So the safety depends on getting it on record fast, Clara said. Precisely. She handed him the folder. Then let's begin. What followed was 4 hours that Clara would later remember, not as dramatic, but as relentless. The careful, exhausting work of going through her written testimony page by page, with Aldridge asking clarifying questions, and a young man in the corner whose name she didn't catch writing everything down. The debt structure, the interest clause, the guardianship language, the morning at the magistrate's office, Crow in the bakery with his hands on the counter, the bruise, the rider on the lower trail, every piece of it in sequence, in her own words, with Aldridge occasionally stopping her to ask about a specific date or a specific phrasing. She didn't perform it. She didn't dramatize it. She said it the way she'd written it, clearly and sequentially and without embellishment. And she noticed that this seemed to work better than dramatics would have, because Aldridge leaned forward more when she was precise than when she was emotional, and the young man in the corner wrote faster. Nora testified after her. Nora's testimony was less organized and more raw, with the particular roughness of someone who hadn't had 3 days to write it down first, and it was in some ways more powerful for that reason. Della's letter was logged into evidence with a case number written on a card attached to it, and Nora held herself together through the whole thing by looking at a fixed point on the wall above Aldridge's desk and not looking away from it. Rowan went last. His testimony was the longest. The 2 years of tracking, the documented cases, the 2 former workers who had given written accounts. He knew the shape of Crow's operation from the outside the way Clara knew it from the inside, and together the 2 accounts built something that was more complete than either one alone. When it was done, Aldridge sat back and looked at the stack of materials on his desk. This is the most comprehensive documentation I've received on a case of this type, he said. Does that mean you'll move forward? Clara asked. It means I'll begin formal proceedings within the week, he said. And I'll need all 3 of you available for follow-up testimony when the time comes. We'll be available, Clara said. She didn't look at Rowan when she said it. She said it because it was her answer to give. They stayed 2 nights in Millhaven, in a boarding house that Rowan had vetted by asking questions Clara didn't fully understand the significance of, but trusted he'd asked for reasons. On the 2nd night, after Nora had gone to sleep, Clara and Rowan sat at the small table in the room they'd been given, separate beds, and Clara had noted without comment that he'd arranged it that way, and he told her something he hadn't said before. Aldridge told me, before you came in, that he already had a separate informant inside one of Crow's operations, Rowan said. Someone who's been passing information for 6 months. Clara looked up from the cup she'd been warming her hands on. Who? He didn't say. He said it was protected, but he said your testimony and the letter are what he needed to connect the internal account to the documented external pattern. So there's someone on the inside, Clara said. Someone who's been doing this for 6 months alone. Yes? She thought about that. She thought about what 6 months of passing information from inside Crow's operation looked like, the risk of it, the daily calculation of whether today was the day you got caught, whether the next person you handed information to was the one who'd take it back to Crow. Is it Ruth? she asked. She said it quietly. Rowan was still for a moment. I don't know, he said. I asked. He wouldn't say. She watched his face. He was doing the thing he did with things he couldn't act on yet. The folding away, the keeping it contained. But his jaw was tight in a way that told her the question had cost him something to consider. If it is her, Clara said carefully, then she's been protecting herself this whole time. She always could, he said. I just couldn't. I couldn't find a way to... He stopped. You couldn't do it alone from the outside, Clara said. That's not the same as failing. He didn't say anything to that. He looked at his hands on the table, large hands, capable, slightly scarred from mountain work and whatever had come before. And then he looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, which was the expression of a man who had been holding something heavy for a very long time and had just for a moment allowed himself to feel the weight of it. Clara held his gaze and didn't look away, and didn't offer him something empty. She just let the moment be what it was. Then he looked back at his hands, and the moment closed, and they both finished their coffee and went to their separate beds. The ride back up the mountain was quieter than the ride down, which Clara hadn't thought was possible. Nora came with them. There was nowhere else that made sense for her to go yet, and the mountain was safer than anywhere Crow could easily reach. She was quiet for most of it, processing something in the way young people process things, which was by going very internal and occasionally saying something that revealed how much work was happening beneath the surface. On the first night camp, she said, without preamble, "What happens if it doesn't work?" "It'll work," Rowan said, and Clara gave him a sharp look because that was the kind of thing you said when you wanted to comfort someone rather than when you believed it. "We don't know that," Clara said to Nora. "What we know is that it's in the federal record now. They can't make it unhappen. If Crow challenges it, he's challenging a federal investigation, which is a different fight than challenging a magistrate in Caldwell Crossing." "But he could still win," Nora said. "Men like him sometimes do," Clara said. "I'm not going to lie to you about that." Nora was quiet. "That's a terrible thing to say." "It's an honest thing to say," Clara said. "And I think you're old enough for honest." Nora thought about it. Della would have said something funny right now. "What would she have said?" Clara asked. Nora almost smiled. "Something about how, at least if we lose, we'll have a very dramatic story to tell at supper." Clara did smile at that briefly. "She sounds like someone worth finding." "She is," Nora said. They made it back to the homestead on the third afternoon to find that something had changed in their absence. The porch railing that Rowan had fixed was broken again. Not worn down or weather loosened, but broken deliberately. The wood splintered inward in the way wood splinters when something hits it from outside. The front window shutter was hanging wrong. Inside, nothing had been taken, but the folder of documents Rowan kept in the back room had been moved. Not obviously, but Clara noticed because she'd spent 2 weeks in that cabin, and she knew where things were, and the folder was 6 inches from where it should have been. "Someone was here," she said. "Yes," Rowan said. He'd already walked the perimeter while Clara and Nora had stayed in the doorway. "One person, maybe 2. They weren't trying to destroy anything. They were looking for something." "The evidence," Clara said. "The original documents," he agreed. "The copies we gave Aldridge. There's nothing up here that can undo those. But Crow doesn't know what we gave him and what we kept." "So he sent someone to find out," Clara said. "And to deliver a message," Rowan said. He pointed to the door frame. Scratched into the wood, recent enough that the scratches were still pale against the weathered surface, were 5 words. "This is not over yet." Clara looked at the words for a long moment. She reached out and ran her thumb across them, not to erase them. She couldn't erase them, but to feel the depth of them, to understand that someone had stood in her doorway and taken the time to cut those words into the wood and had wanted her to know they'd been close enough to do it. "He's scared," she said. Rowan looked at her. "Why do you say that?" "Because he sent someone to look," she said. "If he was confident, he wouldn't need to know what we gave Aldridge. He'd just move forward with whatever he had planned. He's trying to find out how much trouble he's in, which means he already suspects it's a lot." Rowan looked at the scratched words again. "That's a reasonable read." "I'm usually a reasonable reader," she said. She went inside and put the kettle on. Her hands weren't shaking, which she noted the way she noted most things about herself, factually, without judgment. The shaking from the first day in the bakery, when Crow had walked out and she'd stood behind the counter and felt the trembling start, that was gone. She didn't know exactly when it had gone, sometime in the last 2 weeks, somewhere between learning the stove and writing 41 pages and sitting across from Aldridge and saying clearly and sequentially exactly what had happened and exactly what she knew. The shaking had gone, and something steadier had taken its place, though she wouldn't have been able to name exactly what the steadier thing was. The letter from her father arrived 2 days later, carried up by a rider from Varden who also brought supplies and news that Nora's presence on the mountain was apparently not a secret anymore, because the woman at the dry goods in Varden who had sent Nora up in the first place had been visited by 2 men asking questions. The woman had said nothing useful, but the questions meant Crow was tracking the edges. Her father's letter was longer than the first one. The bakery was managing, barely by his own admission, with a lot of help from the neighbor woman on the left side who'd apparently been quietly supplementing what Henry couldn't do, which was something Clara hadn't arranged and didn't know was happening and felt, reading it, a complicated gratitude about. He'd had another visit from Crow's men, more aggressive this time. They'd made specific threats about the building, the lease, the license, the possibility of inspections that could close the bakery down. And then, near the bottom of the letter, in the smallest handwriting, a woman came to the bakery yesterday. She said she used to work for Crow. She said she wanted to help. I didn't know what to tell her. I told her to come back. Was that right? Clara read that paragraph 4 times. She brought the letter to Rowan. He read the relevant paragraph and looked up at her. A woman who used to work for Crow, he said. Who came to my father's bakery, Clara said, which means she knows enough about me to know where my father is. She could be Crow's, Rowan said. A plant. Someone to get close to your father and find out what you've told him. She could be, Clara said. Or she could be someone who worked for Crow and got out and heard what we're doing and wants to add her voice to it. How do you tell the difference? You can't, Clara said. Not from up here. She sat down with the letter and thought about it the way she thought about most problems, which was by laying out what she knew on one side and what she didn't know on the other, and seeing where the weight fell. On one side, the timing was suspicious. Crow's men had just been at the bakery with threats. On the other side, Crow didn't need a plan at this point. He knew where they were. He'd had someone in the cabin. He wasn't lacking for information about their location. I need to go back to Caldwell Crossing, she said. No, Rowan said, and the flatness of it surprised her enough that she looked up. That's not a decision you get to make for me, she said. You'd be walking into the center of everything he controls, Rowan said. After you just testified against him to a federal investigator. If there's any point where he'd be willing to do something he can't easily undo, it's now. I'm aware of that, Claire said, and I'm still saying I need to go. Why? Because the woman at my father's bakery might be exactly what we need, Clara said. An inside voice, a testimony from someone who was inside the operation and came out the other side. Aldridge told you he had an internal informant. This might not be the same person. This might be additional testimony. This might be the piece that makes the difference between Crow paying a fine and Crow losing everything. Rowan looked at her. She could see him working through it, the risk against the value, the way he always worked through things, which was thoroughly and without letting what he wanted to be true influence what was actually true. I'll come with you, he said. I assumed, she said for the second time. They went the next morning, leaving Nora at the cabin with instructions about the trails and the water and a clear statement from Clara that they expected to be back within 4 days and that if they weren't back within 6, Nora should send word to Marin Holloway. The ride back to Caldwell Crossing felt different than either direction of the Millhaven trip. The Millhaven trip had felt like moving towards something. This felt like returning to a place that had been remade in her absence, not by anything that had changed in the town, but by what had changed in her. She had left Caldwell Crossing as a baker's daughter running from a Friday deadline. She was coming back as a woman who had ridden 2 days south, testified before a federal investigator, and scared Ezekiel Crow into sending someone to scratch words into her doorframe. Those were different positions. They came into town from the east, which was not the direct route, but kept them off the main road for longer. Rowan had the particular alertness he carried in towns. Not paranoid, but calibrated. His eyes moving to the spaces between buildings and the upstairs windows with the practiced attention of someone who'd spent 2 years tracking a man who employed other people to watch things. The bakery was still open. Clara could smell it before she could see it. That particular combination of yeast and heat and the specific flour her father preferred, which smelled slightly sweeter than most. And she felt something move in her chest when she recognized it, something that wasn't quite homesickness because she'd been in the building 3 weeks ago, but that was in the same family. Her father was behind the counter. He looked up when she came in and his face did something complicated that Clara didn't have words for, which was fine because she wasn't there for words right now. "The woman," she said. "Did she come back?" "Yesterday," Henry said. "She's coming again today. She said mid-morning." Clara looked at Rowan, who had come in behind her and was standing near the door in a position that was not defensive but would let him see the street. "Good," Clara said. She went behind the counter, which felt both exactly the same and completely different than it had 3 weeks ago, and looked at the bread her father had going in the oven, which wasn't bad. Not her quality, but not bad. "You've been baking the cornbread wrong," she said. "You're not letting it rest long enough before you cut it." "I didn't know there was a right way," Henry said. "There's always a right way," she said, but she said it without the edge it would have had 3 weeks ago, and he seemed to hear the difference. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "Are you coming back?" She stopped. She turned and looked at her father, really looked at him, the way she'd been too busy and too angry to look at him before she'd left. He was thinner than she remembered, or maybe she was just noticing now what had been accumulating for a while. He looked like a man who had been confronted with the practical reality of being responsible for his own life and had found it both harder and more possible than he'd expected. "I don't know yet," she said. That was honest. She didn't know. He nodded. He looked like he'd expected that answer and had decided, for once, not to argue with reality. The woman arrived at 10:30. She was older than Clara had expected, somewhere in her late 40s, with the kind of face that had lived a full life and wasn't trying to hide it. She came in quietly, looked at Clara, and then at Rowan, and something in her expression settled, like she'd been bracing for something and was now recalibrating. "You're the baker's daughter," she said to Clara. "The one who married the trapper." "That's me," Clara said. "Who are you?" "My name is Frances Cole," the woman said. "I kept accounts for Ezekiel Crow for 11 years. The bakery went quiet enough that Clara could hear the bread in the oven. 11 years, Rowan said from the door. He said it carefully. 11 years, Frances repeated. She opened the bag she was carrying and removed a bundle of papers tied with string and set them on the counter between herself and Clara. "I kept copies," she said, "of everything, because I knew, eventually, that I was going to need them." Clara looked at the bundle. It was thick, a year's worth of ledger pages at least, maybe more. "What is this?" Clara asked. "The real books," Frances said. "Crow keeps 2 sets, the ones his lawyers see and these ones. These ones have the actual placement fees, the actual contracts, the actual payments made to and from the boarding houses. These have the names of every woman placed, every fee collected, every county official who received a payment for not asking questions." She said it like someone saying something they'd been building up to say for a long time and were now finally letting out. And Clara recognized the specific exhaustion in her voice, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for longer than you should have had to carry it. "Why now?" Clara asked. 11 years, why now?" Frances looked at her. "Because you went to the federal courthouse," she said. "And because when I heard that a baker's daughter from Caldwell Crossing had gone there with 40 pages of testimony and a letter hidden in a coat lining, I thought, if she can do it, then whatever I've been afraid of isn't bigger than what she wasn't afraid of." The bakery was quiet again. Clara put her hands on the bundle of papers. She didn't pick it up. She just rested her hands on it and thought about Aldridge's office and the pin map on the wall and the 17 names and Nora looking at a fixed point on the wall above the desk and not looking away. "These go to a federal investigator named Aldridge," she said. "Today, with a writer?" and you'll need to testify." "I know," Francis said. "That's why I'm here." Crow's response came that afternoon, which told Clara that he had someone watching the bakery, had probably always had someone watching the bakery, which was a thought she filed in the place where she kept things that she was angry about but couldn't address right now. One of Crow's lawyers appeared at 3 o'clock, a thin man named Whitfield, who wore his competence on his sleeve in the way that hired lawyers sometimes did, and he came in with a document that he set on the counter without preamble. "My client is prepared to offer a settlement," Whitfield said. "Full retirement of your father's debt. No further claims on this property, and a sum of $300 in exchange for withdrawal of all testimony and materials submitted to federal investigators." Clara picked up the document. She read it. She set it back down. "No," she said. "Mrs. Mercer, I'd ask you to consider—" "I considered it," she said. "No." Whitfield looked at Rowan. Rowan looked back at him with an expression that conveyed nothing useful, which was the expression Clara had come to understand he used when he wanted to give someone nothing to work with. "My client is a reasonable man," Whitfield said. "He has no desire for this to become something larger than it needs to be." "It's already larger than it needs to be," Clara said. "It became larger than it needed to be the first time he put his hand on someone who didn't belong to him. I'm not stopping because he's uncomfortable now." Whitfield folded the settlement document back into his briefcase. He looked at Clara with the expression of a man who had delivered many offers and had developed a sense for the ones that weren't going to land, and who was already recalculating on his client's behalf. "He'll retaliate," Whitfield said. It wasn't a threat exactly. It was more like a warning from someone who didn't fully endorse what he was warning about. "I know," Clara said. "He can try." Whitfield left. Henry Ashby, who had been standing in the back of the bakery pretending to adjust shelves during this entire exchange, came forward slowly. "Clara," he said. "Not now, Papa," she said, not unkindly. She was looking at the street through the window where Whitfield had just disappeared. She was thinking about Francis Cole's bundle of papers and what they contained and how fast a writer could get them to Millhaven. She was thinking about Crow, somewhere in this town, receiving the news that his settlement offer had been refused, making the next calculation. And she was thinking, with the particular clarity she'd been developing over the past 3 weeks in stages, that the thing Crow had never accounted for, the thing men like him almost never accounted for, was the specific, durable anger of a woman who had made a decision and didn't see any reason to unmake it. The writer left for Millhaven with Francis Cole's papers before sundown. Clara stood on the bakery step and watched him go, and she felt the weight of what was now in motion. Not the lightness of relief, not the satisfaction of victory, because it wasn't over and she knew that, but the specific heaviness of something important that cannot be taken back. 3 days later, Aldridge sent word that formal proceedings had begun. Crow received the notification on a Friday morning. Clara learned this later through Marin Holloway, who learned it through the network of information that moved through Caldwell. Crossing the way information always moved through small towns, invisibly, completely, and with a speed that had nothing to do with any official system. He was in his office when the federal notice arrived. He read it. He sat with it for a long time. And then, according to the person who had been in the office at the time and would later say so in a statement, he made 3 specific requests: call my lawyers, burn the secondary records, and find out how the Cole woman got out with the books. 2 of those 3 things were already too late to matter. The secondary records had copies in Aldridge's office. Francis had kept them in a location outside Crow's reach for the better part of 2 years, which answered the question of when she'd made her decision, even if the timing of her courage had taken longer. The lawyers were already working, but they were working against 41 pages and a letter hidden in a coat and 11 years of real books, and that was a harder fight than the ones they were used to fighting. Clara heard about all of this gradually, in pieces, the way she'd heard about most things in her life. She didn't hear it in a moment of triumph. She heard it between bread batches and supply runs and the specific daily work of a life that was still being lived while the larger thing moved forward at its own pace. She heard it, and she thought about Crow saying, "We'll see," with his hands flat on her counter. She thought quietly and without any particular drama, "Yes, we're seeing." The formal proceedings took 11 weeks. Claire had known, going in, that 11 weeks was fast for a federal case of this complexity. Aldridge had told her so directly, without softening it, which she'd appreciated. He'd said the documentation was unusually complete, that Francis Cole's secondary books had eliminated the most time-consuming part of the investigation, the reconstruction of financial records that defendants typically counted on being too difficult to reassemble, and that the testimony from Clara, Nora, and 2 additional witnesses who had come forward after word spread through Varden and the surrounding counties had created a record that was, in his professional assessment, extremely difficult to argue against. Difficult, but not impossible. Crow's lawyers were expensive and patient, and they knew how to move slowly inside systems that move slowly by design. They filed 3 separate challenges to the validity of Clara's marriage registration. Each one argued on different procedural grounds, each one requiring a response, each one adding days to the timeline. They challenged the admissibility of Francis Cole's books on the grounds that they had been removed from Crow's premises without authorization. They submitted character witnesses who spoke about Crow's contributions to the commercial life of 3 counties with straight faces and careful language. Clara followed all of it through Aldridge's written updates, which arrived at the Varden post office every week with reliable precision. She read each one at the kitchen table in the mountain cabin, sometimes twice, and then she put them in a folder she'd started keeping for that purpose and went back to whatever the day required. The day usually required a great deal. Life on the mountain had settled into a shape that was nothing like what she'd imagined her life would be, and was also, in ways she was still working out how to think about, more hers than anything she'd lived before. She and Nora had developed a rhythm that had grown naturally out of necessity. Nora was better with the animals, quicker and less hesitant than Clara with the physical demands of the mountain, and Clara was better with the planning, the food management, the kind of structured thinking that kept a household from running out of things at the wrong time. They didn't talk about it as a division of labor. They just did what each of them was better at, which was how most practical partnerships actually worked when people stopped performing and started solving. Rowan moved through all of it in the way he moved through most things. Present, capable, saying less than he was thinking, doing more than he announced. He'd expanded the woodpile before the first hard cold hit, without mentioning he was going to do it. He'd repaired the broken window shutter and also, while he was at it, the 2 boards on the porch floor that had been soft in the way that meant they'd go through entirely within another winter. He came back from a supply run to Varden one afternoon with a second cast iron skillet that was heavier and more even than the first one, and he left it on the stove without comment, and Clara used it the next morning, and it was significantly better than the one she'd been fighting for 6 weeks. She didn't thank him for that one either. She made him coffee and put it in front of him without ceremony, and they both understood what that meant, which was something. It was in the 7th week of formal proceedings that Crow made his final aggressive move, and it came not through lawyers or documents, but through the thing he'd always been most willing to use, which was direct pressure on the people Clara cared about. Henry Ashby's bakery license was suspended on a Tuesday morning on the basis of 3 health code violations that had been reported by an anonymous complaint. The violations themselves were minor: a storage arrangement that was technically non-compliant, a ventilation issue that had existed since the building was constructed and had never been cited before, a record-keeping gap in the flour supplier documentation. Minor individually. Together, with the right inspector at the right time, enough to close the shop. Henry's letter about it arrived the following Saturday. It was the most honest letter he had ever written to her. He wrote that he'd stood behind the counter on Tuesday morning when the inspector came and he had understood, for the first time with his whole body rather than just his mind, what it felt like to be on the receiving end of the kind of power Clara had been trying to stop. He wrote that he had not argued with the inspector and had not signed anything new and had not panicked, which he wanted her to know because he understood those were the 3 instructions she'd left him with. He wrote that Marin Holloway had appeared within 2 hours of the suspension notice and was already working on a formal response through a lawyer in Mill Haven that Aldridge had referred her to. And then, at the bottom, I know I am a man who has done more damage than help in this situation. I don't write that looking for forgiveness. I write it because I want you to know that I understand it now. Whatever happens next, I will not be the person who makes it worse. Clara read that paragraph and then looked at the wall for a while. She wrote back that same day. She wrote that she'd heard about the license, that it was Crow's last play at frightening people who could still be frightened, and that frightened people were the only resource he had left because everything else had been stripped away. She wrote that the suspension would be overturned because the violations were paper-thin, and Marin's lawyer would find that paper-thin in approximately 48 hours. She was right about that. The suspension was overturned in 3 days, but she also wrote, at the end, something she hadn't planned to write and only realized she meant when she was already writing it. You said you want to not make it worse. That's a place to start. It's not nothing. She didn't tell Rowan about that paragraph. Some things were still her own. The case broke open in the 9th week, and it broke the way things that have been building for a long time break. Not with a dramatic single moment, but with a series of things happening in quick succession that together amounted to an avalanche. First, 2 of the county officials named in Francis Cole's secondary books, men who had received payments from Crow's operation for years in exchange for not looking closely at the guardianship filings, chose to cooperate with Aldridge's investigation rather than face federal charges themselves. Their cooperation meant that the legal pathway Crow had used to make his operation look clean was now documented from both sides, inside and outside, in a way that left no reasonable interpretation other than the one Aldridge had been building toward. Second, 3 more women came forward, not women who had escaped, women who were still inside the boarding house placements, who had managed to get word out through the same traveling merchant network that Della had used for her letter. Their statements weren't full testimonies, they couldn't be, not from inside, but they were enough to add to the pattern in ways that made the pattern irrefutable. Third, Aldridge confirmed, in a letter to Rowan that arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, that the internal informant he had referenced in their first meeting was prepared to come forward publicly. He didn't say who it was in the letter. He said they would know when it happened. They found out 4 days later when a woman walked up the mountain trail and knocked on the cabin door. Clara opened it. She looked at the woman standing on the porch. Younger than Clara, maybe 21, with a gap between her front teeth and a way of holding her left shoulder slightly higher than her right. Clara stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "Rowan." He appeared from the side of the cabin where he'd been splitting wood, and he saw her, and he stopped moving entirely for a second that seemed longer than a second, and then he crossed the distance between them in the time it took Clara to step back from the doorway, and Ruth Mercer walked off the porch and into her brother's arms, and they stood there on the rough ground in front of the cabin, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Clara went inside and put the kettle on. She stood at the stove with her back to the window and let them have those minutes without an audience, because some things were not for watching. When they came in, Ruth's eyes were red, and she sat at the table and accepted the coffee Clara put in front of her with a steadiness that was striking. The steadiness of someone who had been building it a long time in difficult conditions, not the steadiness of someone for whom things had been easy. 3 years, Rowan said. He was sitting across from her, and he still hadn't fully let go of looking at her, the way you look at someone you've been looking for so long that seeing them in front of you requires confirmation. "I know," Ruth said. "I couldn't get out sooner without losing what I was building." "You were the informant," Clara said. Not a question. "Since about 8 months in," Ruth said. "The merchant who took Della's letter. He carried a message back to Aldridge for me. It took me 4 months to figure out I could trust him. Then 6 months to build enough that I had something worth passing. You stayed in there on purpose," Rowan said. His voice was controlled, but barely. "I stayed in there because leaving with nothing meant nothing changed," Ruth said. She looked at him directly, with an evenness that told Clara this was a conversation they were going to have more than once. "I knew you were looking for me. I knew you'd eventually find enough from outside. But I had the inside, Rowan. I had the actual books, the names, the schedules, the information that couldn't come from anywhere else. You could have been—" "I know," she said. "I know what I could have been. I made a calculation and I lived with it every day for 3 years, and I don't need you to tell me it was dangerous." She said it without anger, just firmness. "I need you to understand why." Rowan was quiet for a long time. Clara watched him work through it, the same internal process she'd seen him apply to every difficult thing, that thorough examination that didn't let what he wanted to be true distort what was actually true. "I understand why," he said finally. "I don't like it, but I understand it. That's enough for now, Ruth said. Clara looked at the two of them across the table and thought about the specific, complicated nature of love between people who were imperfect and had made choices the other one wouldn't have made, and were still, at the end of all of it, sitting at the same table. It was not a clean thing. It was not a resolved thing. It was a thing that was going to require more conversation and more time and probably more anger than had yet been expressed. But it was real, and it was there, and that counted for more than clean. The trial, or what would have been the trial, ended before it fully began. Crow's lawyers contacted Aldridge in the 10th week with a request to discuss terms. Aldridge sent word to Clara through Rowan, and Clara wrote back a single sentence. I will accept terms only if they are not terms for me alone. What she meant by that, and what Aldridge understood she meant, was that any resolution had to address the whole operation. The women still in the placements, the voiding of the labor contracts, the restitution for every family that had been caught in the debt structure, not just the retirement of her father's debt. She was not interested in an arrangement that made her problem go away and left everything else standing. It took another 4 days of negotiation she wasn't present for between Aldridge's office and Crow's legal team before the terms came back that Aldridge forwarded to her for review. She read them at the kitchen table with Rowan on one side and Ruth on the other. Nora sat across from her, her hands around her coffee cup, waiting. The terms were full guilty plea on charges of fraud and coercive labor practices across 4 counties, immediate release of all women held in placement contracts, with the contracts formally voided by federal order, seizure of Crow's assets, with a portion designated for restitution to affected families in amounts to be calculated by the federal court, permanent bar from operating any business in the territory, no negotiated reduction of charges, no private settlements with individual witnesses. Clara read it twice. She looked at the line about the contracts being voided. She looked at the line about restitution. She looked at the line about no private settlements, which had been her line, the one she'd sent Aldridge, and which was in the final document exactly as she'd written it. This is everything, Nora said quietly. She was looking at the section about the immediate release. Most of it, Clara said. It won't undo 3 years. It won't undo what happened to the families who've already lost things. She put the document on the table. But it stops it from happening to anyone else. Is that enough? Nora asked. Clara thought about it honestly. No, she said. And yes, both at the same time. Crow entered his guilty plea on a Friday morning in Mill Haven. Clara was not in the courtroom. She'd thought about going, had half decided she would, and then on the morning of it had woken up and asked herself what she actually needed from being in that room. And the answer had been nothing that required her physical presence. She'd already said everything she needed to say. She'd said it in writing, in testimony, in the letter to Aldridge, in the refusal of the settlement offer in her father's bakery with Whitfield's document still warm from his briefcase. She found out through Aldridge's letter, which arrived 2 days later, and confirmed that the plea had been entered, the terms had been accepted by the court, and that the federal order voiding the labor contracts had been issued effective immediately. He wrote, in the final paragraph, in language slightly less formal than the rest, I have reviewed a great many cases in my career. I have rarely encountered a witness whose preparation, clarity, and persistence contributed as materially to an outcome as yours did in this matter. That is not something I say to be kind. It is something I say because it is accurate. Clara read that paragraph and felt something she hadn't expected to feel, which was not satisfaction exactly, but something more quiet than satisfaction, a settling. Like something that had been slightly off-center for a long time had shifted into a position that was more accurate. Della came home 6 weeks after the guilty plea, one of 23 women released from Crow's placement operations in the weeks following the federal order. She came home thin and older than her age, and with a way of sitting in rooms that told you she was always tracking the exits, which Clara recognized as the physical imprint of having lived for a long time in conditions where tracking the exits had been necessary. She came to the mountain cabin because Nora was there, and she sat in the kitchen and drank 3 cups of coffee and looked at her sister and said, You came all the way up a mountain for me. I came all the way to Mill Haven first, Nora said. The mountain was actually easier. Della looked around the cabin, at Clara, at Rowan, at Ruth, who had stayed on through the proceedings, and was slowly, carefully reconstructing what it felt like to be somewhere she could leave if she wanted to. She looked at the skillet on the stove and the bread rising on the counter and the folder of Aldridge's letters on the shelf. "What happens now?" Della said. "Now you figure out what you want," Clara said. "That's all. Just that." Della looked at her. "Is it that simple?" "No," Clara said, "but it starts there." Henry Ashby's bakery license was fully restored. The suspension was expunged from the record as part of the fallout from Crow's conviction because the anonymous complaint that had triggered it was traced back to one of Crow's people and could not be treated as legitimate. Henry wrote Clara a letter about this that was shorter than his recent ones, just a few lines, the tone of a man who was done explaining himself and was trying to just do the work instead. He wrote, "The cornbread is better. I've been letting it rest longer." Clara smiled at that. She actually smiled, out loud, alone at the table where she read her letters, which was something she did rarely enough that Rowan heard it from outside and came to the door and looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between curious and something warmer. "Good news?" he said. "My father figured out the cornbread," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then, slowly, he also smiled, which was something she'd seen him do rarely enough that she'd begun to notice the specific quality of it. It started at one side of his mouth and moved late to the other side, like it was still deciding whether to commit. "High praise," he said. "From me," she agreed. "Yes." Winter came to the mountain in November with the particular conviction of a season that wasn't interested in being gradual about it. The temperature dropped fast, the snow came heavy, and the cabin became the entire world for stretches of days when the trails were impassable. Clara had grown up with winters she thought were hard. Mountain winters were a different argument entirely. Colder, more serious, more demanding of the specific kind of competence that came from paying attention rather than from general intelligence. She paid attention. She'd been paying attention since the first morning. The cabin held all 5 of them for the worst weeks of December, Clara and Rowan, Ruth, Nora and Della, and the closeness of it was sometimes difficult and occasionally maddening, and also, underneath all of that, something she wouldn't have given up. There were arguments about small things, which were almost always about larger things, and there were evenings around the stove that were quiet in the particular way that quiet was comfortable, and there were nights when Clara could hear Della moving around the cabin at 2 a.m. because she couldn't sleep, and Clara would get up and make coffee, and they'd sit together and not talk much, which seemed to be what Della needed and what Clara could give. One evening in late December, Rowan came in from checking the horses and stamped the snow off his boots and sat at the table and said, without looking up, "Aldridge wants you to come to Mill Haven in the spring. There's a review process starting for the restitution calculations. He thinks your testimony about the original debt terms would help establish the baseline." "When in spring?" Clara asked. "April, maybe May." "I'll go," she said. Same as before. He looked up then. "You don't have to keep doing this. The case is resolved." "The restitution isn't resolved," she said. "The families who lost things haven't gotten anything back yet. That's still part of it." Rowan looked at her with the expression she'd been learning the shape of over months now. Not surprised exactly, because she didn't think she surprised him much anymore, but something like the ongoing recognition of a quality he hadn't fully anticipated when he'd walked into her father's bakery and noticed a bruise. "All right," he said. She went back to the bread she was shaping. The stove was running slightly hot on the left side, which it always did in extreme cold. She'd figured out the adjustment 3 months ago, and it was automatic now. Somewhere in the middle of January, on a night when the snow was coming down thick enough outside that you couldn't see the tree line from the cabin window, Rowan said something that hadn't been said before between them. He said it quietly, without announcement, while they were sitting at the table after supper, Ruth and Nora and Della having gone to their rooms, the lamp burning low. He said, "I know this isn't what you planned for yourself." Clara was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It isn't." "I know the marriage was a legal arrangement." "It was," she said. He looked at the table. "Is that still all it is?" She thought about the question the way she thought about hard questions, honestly and without performing the answer she thought she was supposed to give. She thought about the skillet and the gloves and the coffee at 6 in the morning. She thought about the way he'd looked at Ruth when she walked up the mountain trail. She thought about the conversation in the Millhaven boarding house room, about the moment that had opened and then closed, and what had been in it. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's the honest answer." "All right," he said. "Is that enough for now?" she said, which was the same thing Ruth had said to him, and he recognized it because she saw it register in his face. "Yes," he said. "That's enough for now." It was enough, and it was honest. And between people who had built something real by being honest with each other under conditions that did not encourage it, honesty was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. Spring came late but came well, the way mountain springs came. Slowly and then all at once, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the creek running loud with the runoff, the light lasting longer each evening until one day you noticed you'd had an extra hour of it without realizing when it started. Clara made the trip to Millhaven in April. The restitution review took 3 days. She testified clearly and specifically about the debt structure, the same way she'd testified before. And when it was done, Aldridge shook her hand and said the baseline she'd established would govern every family's calculation. On the last day in Millhaven, she walked past the federal courthouse and stopped on the wide steps where she and Nora had stood in the fall, before they'd gone in, before any of the things that had followed. She stood there for a while in the April light and thought about the woman who had stood here 7 months ago with 41 pages under her coat and a 17-year-old she'd known for 2 days beside her, and no certainty about anything except that going forward was the only option that had anything in it worth having. She thought about what she'd said to Nora that morning on the steps. "Have you ever done anything like this before?" "No? You?" "No." "Does it feel as serious to you as it feels to me?" "More." She thought about the fact that the seriousness had been correct, and that they'd done it anyway, and that doing it anyway was apparently who she was, had always been maybe, though she hadn't known it through all those years of early mornings and ledger books and watching her father sit with his cold coffee. She thought about the bread at 4 a.m. in the dark, shaped by feel, because her hands knew the work even when she couldn't see. She thought about Ruth and Della and Nora and Frances Cole with her 11 years of copied books, and she thought about the 17 names that were now 17 women who had placement contracts that were voided and couldn't be reinstated, and she thought about all the families Aldridge's office was currently calculating restitution for, and she thought about the specific particular price that Crow was paying and would keep paying, and she felt not triumph but something more durable than triumph, a sense that justice, when it arrived, was rarely as clean as you wanted it to be, and that it required more from more people than any single story could hold, and that it was still worth every piece of what it cost. She walked back to the boarding house where Rowan was waiting. He was on the porch with coffee because he'd figured out, over 7 months of paying attention, that she came back from difficult things better when there was coffee immediately available and no immediate questions. He handed her the cup without comment. She sat down beside him and looked at the street. "Done?" he asked. "The testimony part," she said. "The restitution will take months." "But you're part of it." "My part of it," she said. "Yes." He nodded. They sat with the coffee and the April light for a while. Then she said, "I want to go home." She said home, and she meant the mountain. She noticed that she meant it, and that it didn't feel like something she was deciding. It felt like something that had already been decided, gradually, between one morning and the next, between one burned skillet and one repaired porch board, and one late conversation at the table and another, until home was the mountain and the cabin and the people in it. And it had happened the way most real things happened, which was without announcement and without ceremony and without any single moment you could point to and say, "There, that was when." Rowan looked at her when she said it. He looked at her with the expression that started at one side and moved late to the other. "Then let's go home," he said. The road back up the mountain was 4 hours, the same as it had always been. The aspens along the upper trail were coming in green, that particular early spring green that was almost yellow, the kind that made everything it was next to look like it was lit from inside. The horses knew the way without much direction from either of them. Clara rode with the leather folder still in her bag, the folder that had started with 41 pages and now held all of Aldridge's letters, the restitution documents, a copy of the guilty plea, and a letter from Nora that she hadn't told anyone about yet, which said that Nora and Della were thinking of starting something in Varden, some kind of coordinated support for women in difficult situations, and asked if Clara would be willing to write down some of what she'd learned about the legal process so they'd have it when they needed it. She was going to say yes. She already knew that. She was also going to write the thing down properly, not as a legal document, not as testimony, but as something plain and clear and written for the kind of woman who stood behind a bakery counter with flour on her hands and a bruise on her wrist, and no idea yet that the options she thought she had were not the only options there were. She hadn't figured out exactly what it would say. She'd figure it out the same way she'd figured out the stove and the trails and the right amount of water for the right container, by starting and adjusting and not stopping in the middle. The cabin came into view around the upper curve of the trail, the same as it always did, was low and weathered and unimpressive, with the mismatched shutters and the porch where the railing had been broken and fixed and broken again and fixed again, and the smoke coming from the chimney because Ruth had started the fire that morning before they left, because Ruth had turned out to be the kind of person who thought about what others would come home to, which was one of many things about her that Clara had not expected and had come to count on. The same hands that had baked bread under fear, shaped it in the dark, written it down in 41 pages, and carried it into a federal courthouse now held the reins loosely, guiding the horse the last distance up the familiar trail. They were ordinary hands, flour-dusted, slightly scarred, competent. They were not the hands of a hero, because Clara Ashby had never thought of herself as a hero and didn't start now. They were the hands of a woman who had looked at an impossible situation, found the least terrible option, and kept finding the next one after that, until the options that had seemed impossible became the things that actually happened. That was all. That was also, it turned out, enough.